Ever since the birth of mankind, we've been creating stories to make sense of the world around us. For as far back as we can remember, we have gathered around the campfires to tell amazing tales, not only to entertain, but also to educate. Science fiction has always been about looking towards the future, but each story is informed by the hopes and fears of the time that they were written. In this series, I want to take a look at the lives of the people who wrote these stories. Using their works as a time machine, we can gain an insight into their world. What was happening in their society? What drove them to write? And what do their stories mean for us today? This is Science Fiction, a Human History. Herbert George Wells was born in Bromley, Kent in 1866. Better known as H.G. Wells, he is recognised as one of the founding fathers of science fiction, and countless modern authors are indebted to his explorations of time travel, alien life, and spacefaring adventures. His works have been adapted for radio, film, TV, and continue to be enjoyed to this day, not only for their gripping narratives, but for their relevancy to the world around us even a century after they were written. But who was H.G. Wells? What kind of world did he grow up in? And how did that shape the stories that he told? As a young boy, Wells showed great academic promise, but was forced to leave school at the age of 13 due to his family's financial difficulties. After working several jobs in his youth, in 1884 he was fortunate enough to gain a scholarship to what is now the Imperial College of Science and Technology. It was here that he would study under T.H. Huxley, a great advocate for the theories put forward by one Charles Darwin. Wells's studies of Darwinism opened his mind, and he was fascinated with these new theories of natural science. His imagination fired, he went on to create some of the most definitive works of the genre, using his background in science as a starting point from which to explore strange new worlds. But first, let's get a bit of background on Darwinism and why it was so important. Charles Darwin first published his book on the origin of species in 1859. Now, the book outlined his theories on how life on Earth might have developed, and it was inspired by his travels to the Galapagos Islands. While he was there, Darwin observed that the animals on the islands all seemed to possess slight differences depending on their environment. A finch on one island where hard seeds were the most abundant food had a strong beak for cracking them open, whereas finches on islands where spiked fruit was more common had long, thin beaks that allowed them to eat the fruit without getting a face full of thorns. Darwin spotted more and more examples of animals that, despite their similarities, all seemed to have attributes that appeared to make them perfectly suited to their individual environment. And from this, he was able to draw three hypotheses. One, that despite their differences, each animal must share a common ancestry. The differences were likely the result of the variations that naturally occur in a species. For example, a beetle might be born a slightly different colour, or a tortoise might be born with a slightly longer neck. 2. Some of these natural changes, such as differences in beak size, gave certain species an advantage over others and allowed them better access to what food was available. And 3. Animals born with these advantages would pass them on to their offspring. We might start with one bird with a strong beak, but as they procreate, that trait becomes more and more common until eventually they are the dominant species on that island. These ideas formed the basis of Darwin's theory of evolution, and was revolutionary for the time. Though he wasn't the only person to have this idea, it was still the generally held belief, particularly in the West, that man was the creation of God, and that humans, as the Bible put it, have dominion over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing. But now, humanity had been placed on a level pegging with animals. And in his second book, The Descent of Man, Darwin even went one step further and suggested that humans and apes might share a common ancestor. These ideas caused an uproar, but they were welcomed by many scientists of the time. Huxley, who would later go on to teach Wells, diligently defended the idea of human evolution, and he engaged in fierce debate with church leaders and dissenting scientists. The theory of evolution would go on to become one of the backbones of modern science. And to this day, discoveries in genetics and hereditary traits continue to provide further support to an idea that was first put forward over a century ago. So we know that Darwin's ideas were a pretty big deal. Humans were no longer the product of an all-powerful spirit, but just another animal fighting for survival. But this also begged the question: if humans had evolved from animals, who was to say they wouldn't continue to evolve further? And if they did, how might the political and social climate of the late 18th century affect this evolution? In a time when the Industrial Revolution had generated immense wealth for the rich, but had left the working classes with very little, it's not surprising that Wells, a devout socialist raised in a low-income family, might yearn to see a better future for mankind. Wells left college and went into teaching, eager to impart this new learning to the next generation. He taught for several years, but then failing health forced him to step back, and instead he had to focus on writing to earn his living. Now, throughout his school days, he'd been working on a story that would see its hero go on adventures through time. An early version of this story, The Chronic Argonaut, had been published in his school paper, but several rewrites later, it began to be known by a very different name. First published in 1895, The Time Machine follows the time traveller on a journey thousands of years into humanity's future. There, he meets the Eloi, a race of beautiful humans who live a life of complete leisure. However, their paradise has come at a cost, and by night the Eloi are preyed on by the dreaded Morlocks, strange ape-like creatures that live below the ground and only come out in the dark. There's also a chapter later on in the book where the time traveller goes even further into the future and is attacked by these giant crab monsters. However, this never seems to make it into any film adaptation of the book. The book gives us the first use of the word time machine, and although it wasn't the first story to explore time travel as a concept, it was the first one to do so with science, and created this idea that time travel could actually be possible one day. A new genre was born, one that would go on to give us such classics as Back to the Future, Doctor Who, and of course, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. The Eloi and the Morlocks were Wells's first look at the possibilities of evolution, and what it might mean for the future of mankind. Both are descended from modern humans, but through changes in their environment, they've been drastically altered until two very different races have emerged. The novel was meant to expose the class tensions of Victorian Britain, with the Eloi and the Morlocks representing the upper and working classes of the time. The Eloi, through centuries of exploiting the lower classes, have evolved beyond the need for intelligence or strength. Their days are spent playing in the fields and rivers, and they enjoy a completely blissful existence, having all of their needs met, but lacking any drive or passion. The Morlocks, however, have been forced underground, to the point where they are now unable to see in daylight. They have been stripped of their humanity and have resorted to cannibalism. During the Industrial Revolution, the upper classes enjoyed huge benefits but were utterly reliant on a mass underpaid workforce to power their machines. Similarly, the Eloi are completely dependent on the Morlocks, who through centuries of hard work and toil have finally gained the upper hand, treating the Eloi like cattle and rearing them for slaughter. Wells paints both the Eloi and the Morlocks as the worst possible outcome for their ancestors, driven to extremes by thousands of years of social prejudice. Events today are shown to have far-reaching consequences, and he asks his readers to consider what might become of us if we continue down this evolutionary path. Evolution is often thought of as a timeline, and a lot of us will be familiar with the image of humans gradually evolving from apes. And whilst this isn't quite what is meant by the theory of evolution, it's an interesting starting point from which to look at Wells's next novel. If humanity can evolve forward, are we also in danger of slipping back? The Island of Dr. Moreau is a story of humanity forcibly exerting its power over nature. The eponymous island is populated by the beast folk, strange creatures who seem to possess traits of both humans and animals. We discover as the book goes on that the Doctor has been conducting hideous experiments in vivisection, cutting animals open whilst they are still alive and rearranging their limbs and organs. He aims to reshape these beasts into men and shows little regard to the pain he inflicts. The book, first published in 1896, is pretty dark, and even Wells referred to it as a blasphemous tale. We see again the ideas of evolution, but here they are forced upon the creatures. When Darwin observed the changes in his species, he knew that this must have happened over thousands of years. But we humans are mortal and a bit too busy to wait that long. So here we have someone disregarding the natural order and expediting evolution in his own perverse way. Moreau quickly learns from his experiments that it's not enough for the beast folk to simply look like humans, they have to be taught to behave like them as well. To do this, he gives them the law, a parody of the 10 Commandments that the beast folk are forced to recite.
Not to go on all fours, that is the law, are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law, are we not men? Not to eat fish or flesh, that is the law, are we not men? Not to claw the bark of trees, that is the law, are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law, are we not men?
Anyone who breaks these rules is quickly punished, beaten with whips and tortured. Those that Moreau deems complete failures are destroyed. He argues that the law is essential for preventing the beast folk from slipping back to their old habits. This proves true, as later in the book, when Moreau is killed, the beast folk gradually begin to forget the law, becoming more and more like the animals that they once were. In the closing chapters of the book, when the protagonist has managed to escape the island and returned home to England, he cannot face his fellow humans, seeing them as no better than animals. Wells seems to be suggesting that for all our assumed superiority, we too can quickly slip back into our bestial natures. I've read that the Island of Dr. Moreau was inspired in part by Wells's disgust at the trial of Oscar Wilde. In a collected edition of his work, Wells wrote, "There was a scandalous trial about that time, and the graceless and pitiful downfall of a man of genius. And this story was a reminder that humanity is but animal, rough-hewn to a reasonable shape, and in perpetual internal conflict between instinct and injunction." Wells is famous for his forward-thinking ideas of equality and justice. The idea of humans as an evolving species suggests that one day we might evolve beyond our baser natures and enter a true utopia of peace. However, Wells knew all too well that the time in which he wrote was not a peaceful one, and that before we could transcend to a higher state of being, there were many injustices that must first be addressed. And slowly, but surely, he began work on what is perhaps his most famous novel. The War of the Worlds, first serialised in 1897, is regarded as the first alien invasion story. Martian aggressors land on Earth in terrifying war machines and quickly lay waste to all in their path. Humanity is desperately unprepared to meet their assailants, and through the eyes of our narrator, we are shown the harrowing and devastating impact of a war with a technologically superior enemy. The story is perhaps one of the most famous science fiction novels ever written. It's been adapted for screen numerous times and has even had 2 different sequels written for it. It gave us sci-fi classics like The Heat Ray and Interplanetary War, and showcases some of Wells's best work. But whilst the legacy of the book in fiction is undeniable, its inspiration is far darker, casting a critical eye on the British Empire and the devastating impact of colonialism. At its height, the British Empire was the largest the world has ever seen, and ruled over 23% of the Earth's population. Its origins can be traced back to the 16th century, when maritime expansion and competition from other European countries drove Britain to explore, conquer, and settle on vast areas across the world. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, various companies set up colonies around the world in order to exploit the raw resources such as sugar and tobacco. These companies were gradually acquired by the British Crown and were given a monopoly on those resources, provided all trade was conducted through Britain and with English ships. These raw resources were seen as essential to British trade, and slaves were traded between Africa and the American colonies in order to work in plantations. This selling of human lives was seen as being of economic importance to the empire, and between 1640 and 1807, It is estimated that Britain transported 3.1 million Africans to its colonies. Of those 3.1 million, it is thought nearly 500,000 died in transit. An examination of conditions aboard slave ships shows humans being treated worse than cattle. In 1803, Britain began its colonisation of Tasmania, an island off the coast of Australia. The island was home to the indigenous people known as the Palawa, who had been cut off from the mainland as a result of rising sea levels in around 6000 BCE. This meant that they had had no interaction with the outside world, until roughly 7,500 years later, when Western settlers first arrived. By the time British colonisation began, it is estimated that between 3,000 to 15,000 Palawa were living on the island. Between 1803 and 1830, the Palawa endured horrific treatment. The Europeans regarded them as an inferior species, routinely harassing them and depleting their food supplies. Murder, rape and kidnapping were all too common occurrences, and within just 27 years, all but 400 of the indigenous population had been killed. By 1876, it was thought that no indigenous people of Tasmania remained, and though this claim has been challenged in recent years, there are many who regard that what was perpetrated by the British was nothing short of genocide. The War of the Worlds was inspired by a conversation between Wells and his brother about the Palawan massacre. Throughout the book, he lays bare what war with an advanced enemy might mean, not only in terms of fighting, but in the legacy that is left behind. The Martians used giant fighting machines to devastate the human population. Their terrible heat rays shoot invisible beams that can scorch the land, and they disperse poisonous clouds of black smoke on the fleeing masses. Much like the Palawa against their invaders, Britain's armies are hopelessly outmatched and easily massacred. As the novel goes on, we learn that the Martians have brought with them a thick red weed. The narrator speculates that this may have been done by accident, but comments how it seems to spread out from the landing sites and along rivers. Whether intentional or not, the red weed changes the landscape of the countryside, choking rivers and terraforming the planet to make it more and more like the Martians' home. The island of Dr. Moreau can also be viewed as taking a critical look at Western dominance in its colonies. The Doctor might be seen as the white man who has forced a way of life on the animals, tearing them apart to conform to his idea of perfection, and torturing and killing those who do not follow his rules for a so-called civilized existence. Evolution seems to be a common theme in Wells's work. In The War of the Worlds, the narrator speculates that the Martians may share a common ancestry with humans, and that they appear to be much further along the evolutionary scale. He suggests that the Martians have evolved into beings of great intelligence, doing away with their limbs and organs and instead using machines to complete everyday tasks. However, this turns out to be their downfall, as their comparatively weak bodies have left them vulnerable to the diseases of Earth, and the Martians are all but wiped out not long after their arrival. Much like in The Time Machine, evolution is shown as a potential hazard for our future. Just as the Eloi evolved beyond their ability to defend themselves, the Martians have evolved into beings of superior intellect but at the expense of their bodies, and ultimately, they pay the price. Good science fiction always comments on the time it was written, but really great stories have the power to draw parallels even decades later. The Massacre of Mankind, a sequel to War of the Worlds written by Stephen Baxter in 2017, is set 13 years after the original story. It looks at the impact the Martian invasion had on humanity, and how the course of history was altered by their presence. We might look at colonialism in the same way. There are still those today who benefit from Britain's colonial past, and many more for whom it continues to have a detrimental impact. The Time Machine looks at a future where inequality has had a devastating impact on the world. If we built a time machine today, what might we have evolved into if we don't challenge the injustices of today?